Well, hello. Ken here from AWS Made Easy. Welcome. Happy Halloween, everybody. Stephen Barr with AWS Made Easy. We've got a really great pre-recorded episode today with Alex Kearns. He is a friend. He is an AWS ambassador based in the UK. And we met a couple of weeks ago in person well, we didn't meet for the first time, but we got together in person to talk about what the AWS Hero program is like, what he does as a living, his career trajectory to becoming an AWS ambassador. So really looking forward to playing this pre-recorded interview for you. Before we get started, hello to everyone in the chat, and wanted to know what you're being for Halloween this year. So I am Ken, if you don't recognize. So yeah, please comment in the chat, say what you're being for Halloween, and yep, there you go, Lydia, you got it. It is Ken. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. Yes, we're gonna have a beautiful, perfect Halloween. So hope you all have a really lovely Halloween out there. So what we'll do in a minute here, let's get everyone a chance to join the stream, and then we will start the interview with Alex Kearns. I posted a few links to a prior episode, episode 72 with Rohini Gaunkar. We talked about getting ready for reInvent. So if it is your first time, that episode is full of awesome tips and suggestions for how to make the most out of reInvent. I think one of the top ones that I didn't realize is things are really far apart. Even though if you see on the map, the hotels are right next together, and you say, okay, I got a 10:30 talk here, and then I'll run over to the 10:45 over there. That's not going to happen. So even if you can run really fast, just getting out of the hotel and into the next one, that one's tricky. Lots of great tips in that episode, how to get the most out of your reInvent. We have the generative AI hackathon coming up on Friday and next Friday. We've got some great AWS guests scheduled. So check out the CloudFix page for the next couple of upcoming episodes. We have generative AI topics. We've got Justin Thomas of AWS talking about generative AI with us. We've got Carlos Galan from Just Eat Takeaway talking about FinOps. So it's going to be a great set of episodes coming up. Well, without too much further ado, I want to present. Oh, and then Shalon said, I am Kenough. Thank you, Shalon. I actually have the hoodie with I am Kenough, and unfortunately, it didn't arrive in time for the live stream, but I've got the tie-dyed hoodie. It should be on its way. I'll have it today for the evening festivities. What are you going to be, Shalon? What are you going to be, Lydia? And then it's Carlin. Hi, Mom. Never seen Ken with a beard. Well, this is a first, one of many firsts on the AWS Made Easy live stream. So thank you for joining. We hope to be pioneering not just AWS discourse, but also great costumes and stage settings and props along the way. All right, let me cue up Alex's awesome interview. Here we go. And yeah, please ask any questions in the channel, and we'll see you at the end. I'll be placing links as well.
But
nope, wrong video. Give me one moment here. Let's remove that one and that one. I am okay, Joe. Why don't we just beginning? Just apologies. Slight technical. Getting to the right spot. Give me 1 second here.
the fact that I'd done the, I can't remember what it was called.
There we go.
Architect at Ubertas Consulting, based in the UK. That is me.
All right.
And we got to meet at reInvent.
Oh, and then Shalon, cowboy, until my 6-year-old nephew made fun of me for it. LOL. Thanks, Shalon. All right, we've got the video with Alex queued up now. Really looking forward to this great discussion. I'll be posting links in the comments, so just please follow along. And if we have any questions for Alex, I'll make sure to get those to him, and maybe we'll do a follow-up post reInvent. All right, thanks everyone. Here goes. And you got to meet with Rahul, and then also we saw each other at the AWS Summit in London.
We did.
And so it's been a long time coming, this meeting, so grateful you can be here.
I know it's so nice to actually do these things in person as well. We've been talking about it for so long, and then the opportunity came up whilst I was in Seattle to get it done.
Awesome. So, well, I guess let's start from Seattle, and then we'll rewind backwards. So how was this Ambassador Summit?
It was great. It's my first global summit. So for those people that don't know, the Ambassador Program is run by the AWS Partner Network. So to be an ambassador, you have to work for an AWS partner. The idea of the ambassadors is that we are extensions of the AWS team. So kind of similar to heroes, I guess, in that it's a recognition of knowledge and a recognition of contribution to a community, but with a bit more of a partner focus. So over the last couple of days, we've had some great talks from various VPs and directors of AWS. It's also a great opportunity that we've had to share and connect between partners. So being able to share ideas of what people are working on and what's worked for them and what hasn't worked for them. It's a very trusting environment, and it almost seems unintuitive to share things with competitors, but the trust works both ways, and we often find that what hasn't worked for one person may work for another. So,
well, I guess what I've found in those environments is that there's an understanding that there's a big pie out there. There's enough for everyone.
There is, and everyone's going after a little part of that pie. It's a different part of the pie as well. So for us, it's migration and modernization. For someone else, it could be data and machine learning. Someone else could be pure modelization and only touch Kubernetes, for example. So it's a really diverse crowd, and it's really good to see.
So how is Ambassador? Give us a little more background on the Ambassador Program. So what purpose does it serve? Who is it targeting, and who can become an ambassador?
So in terms of the Ambassador Program itself, so the Ambassador Program has been around in its current form for, I think, 5 years, maybe 6 years. And it was launched by AWS as a way to enable individuals that work for AWS partners to be recognized, but also as a way for customers who want to use AWS partners to identify those partners who are seen by AWS to have individuals that are going over and above in terms of things like this, contributing to the community and kind of giving back in terms of knowledge and content to help others grow. In terms of the becoming an ambassador, there are some requirements for it in terms of things like you have to be publicly contributing, you have to be producing quality contributions, you have to maintain a certain level of AWS certifications. That bar is always rising. We have an extraordinary number of ambassadors now that are certified in everything. The kind of fabled AWS golden jacket.
That's really cool.
Is only available to ambassadors officially. There are lots of knockoff golden jackets you see, but the only official ones are through the Ambassador Program.
All right, we're gonna have to put one of these golden jackets on the screen so that people can see this. Okay.
I'll share some photos from the Global Summit this week. We had a great selection of new golden jacket members. Probably maybe 10 more, but now we're within the program up to double digits in percentages.
Wow, that's a phenomenally competent bunch of people.
It is. It's really refreshing as well, because I think there's nothing worse than being the smartest person in the room, because you have no ability to grow. So having the opportunity to come out to Seattle and mix with the kind of top people at AWS, but also the ability to come out here and mix with people who are smarter than me it's great. It's such a brilliant learning opportunity, but also really nice to be able to then take any learnings back to my employer as an AWS partner and start to pull them into our plans for the future.
That sounds great. So what were your impressions of downtown Seattle, of the AWS headquarters, seeing all that in person? Having seen it incrementally, you kind of forget, just the impact of it.
Yeah, so as I said, my first time in Seattle, so didn't really know what to expect. Been to the States before, been kind of New York and Las Vegas for reInvent, but first time outside of the kind of those big hubs. And yeah, it's the only way I can describe it is it almost feels like or certainly the parts that I was in, it's kind of South Lake Union area, it feels almost like a big university campus, but a university campus kind of just for Amazon employees. Every corner you go around, it's an Amazon Go or an Amazon Office, and it's from an AWS Ambassador perspective, it's brilliant because you're fully immersed in it. It's the same with reInvent. You know that you're going to get a week of nothing but AWS. But I got in a few days early, so the official summit program didn't really start until kind of Monday, Tuesday, and got in on Saturday. So I managed to do some sightseeing around the area and kind of tick off all the big attractions. And it's nice to be a tourist sometimes.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I agree. And Seattle has a lot to offer in that respect.
Yeah, I think for me, it's how close it is with nature as well. You go up the Space Needle and look out, and one way is you could be looking at somewhere like New York. It's just a kind of vast metropolis, and then you walk around the other side, and it's kind of lakes and mountains, and yeah, it's a city of kind of two halves almost.
Yeah, I like how you were saying earlier, like with the water and with the greenness. Like when I fly into LA, right? You think, okay, this is just city forever, and it's dry, and there's a beauty in that. But then it's just seeing the lakes, the mountains, and all of it integrated and together. It's pretty neat. I kind of forget how special it is.
Yeah, LA is strange. You fly out of LA, and when you take off, you obviously either take off over the sea or over kind of downtown. But it is just sea and then lights. There's no green belt or anything anywhere in that. It is just urban or water.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's rewind backwards. So what's your history in tech in general? Like what got you into computers, into programming, into any of this?
So I guess I'm relatively early on still in my career. I'm 26. I graduated in 2018, doing computer science university. So I've always been interested in computers. It's always been a hobby of some description, even going back to kind of pretty much being able to remember like at a high school level where the curriculum was building Excel spreadsheets, and it was kind of, I got bored and was fortunate to have a teacher that really pushed me and said, go and read this book about building websites. So started building things with HTML and CSS, and that kind of just sparked a bit of an interest. But even things like as a younger person, taking apart the family computer, and well, I didn't put it back together again, but I learned how to take it apart, and then in future I learned how to build one. But expensive mistake. But yeah, it's the there's always been this interest in computers. For me, there's never been any doubt that a career would end up somewhere in tech. But to begin with, it was software dev. So my first role was a startup, and it was doing kind of web development. Kind of strangely, we've gone full circle in that it was working for a chatbot company. But back then, this would have been 2017. Chatbots were either very primitive natural language processing based or rule based. And then you fast forward to now, and it's like, yeah, generative AI has completely blown that out of the water.
One of my siblings was working for a chatbot company, and they disclosed that it was an enormous set of if-then regular expressions, really trying to narrow down what is the intent, before you have things like Lex, and you can just say, here's an intent that I have. Try and figure out, is this the intent that the client is expressing? But no, it's a big set of regular expressions and case statements, and at the very end it says, well, I don't know what you're saying.
Well, everyone's had that experience where you go onto a website and you try and speak to a chatbot, and if you don't phrase it kind of reasonably closely to how the developer intended, it's just not going to get it. And yeah, so that's kind of funny going full circle from that into generative AI emerging now. Following that, I kind of started picking up some interest in cloud, but at that stage it was just, we had some EC2 instances. It was nothing particularly special. It was more DevOps than anything else.
And so when did you get started with consulting?
So my first technically consulting role was the job after that. So I moved to BT. So I guess maybe US people don't know who BT are. BT being kind of biggest telecoms company in the UK.
British Telecom.
British Telecom, absolutely. And with them, it was technically a consulting role, but it was going to be consulting for government projects, but cloud consulting with that. However, I joined them probably about 5 days before the first lockdown. And in order to consult on government projects, you have to go through government clearance. And as a result of COVID, the entire clearance process just shut down.
Oh, I see. If you have to get clearance in person, but you can't be in person.
Yeah, exactly. So it took them a while to actually figure out how do we clear people without putting them in the same room. And that never really got going. So I did a lot of kind of, I describe it as internal consultancy. So it was more of the kind of cloud center of excellence role than anything else.
Okay, so within a company as large as British Telecom, there's going to be different teams that have different practices, different levels of cloud maturity. So you're trying to bring them all. Well, you can be a kind of center of knowledge, center of best practices to really help the different teams get on the same page in terms of cloud. I mean, you see that a lot, even in as something as regulated as a telecom or medical, where you get these shadow IT teams where someone pulls out their own corporate card, and all of a sudden you've got other AWS accounts and multiple
servers
organizations.
Under desks, the whole lot.
Yeah. Oh yeah, servers under desks.
It was, but that for me is probably where the first form of evangelism started appearing. So it wasn't public evangelism, but it was actually an internal evangelism of cloud, because a lot of the senior leaders had come from, or had been at BT for a long, long time. So for a long time, especially on those cleared projects, cloud wasn't an option because the data is too sensitive or anything like that. So no one had ever really thought about how do we use this cloud thing. Instead, people would default to, well, let's just put it on a server in a data center. So almost having to evangelize cloud to internal stakeholders to say, okay, well, we know we can't put this data in S3 because it's data that's kind of national security level data. What we can do is we can do development. We can have fake data. We can synthesize data and build these systems in the cloud, rather than buying loads of tin to test things on. Build them in the cloud, test them on EC2, and then deploy them on premise if you can't deploy them in the cloud for production.
I was in a similar situation with a cancer research hospital where they weren't ready to have actual patient data in the cloud, but we could do experiments and build out all of our infrastructure on synthetic patients who had the same data fields, and make sure everything worked, and then deploy it the way we had to then.
It's crazy because even now you look at the things that AWS are doing to try and make that better. So you have things like outposts. So outposts obviously allowing you to run certain AWS things on premises. The kind of snowball, snow cone, etc. Them allowing you to run S3 Lambda functions on a device that you can pick up and carry around with you. Even to the full extent of, I'm sure I saw something on one of the AWS blogs around, it was a military specific version of the cloud, and they would literally bundle up a data center into a shipping container and drop it into a desert for you. And as long as you could power it, then you had access to AWS services in the middle of a desert in a war zone.
That's pretty phenomenal that you'd have whatever they're doing with it, right? We could only speculate.
Yeah, of course.
Image recognition, some kind of signal processing, localized. But that's pretty cool to think that you could actually have that technology available at your fingertips in who knows where.
And there was something that someone, I can't remember who said it on Tuesday in one of the talks. I think it might have been Bill Vass, the VP of engineering. And he's kind of saying everything really at AWS is software defined. Like, we have to have certain pieces of hardware to do certain things. So if, for example, if you want to do machine learning, you want to do generative AI, you're going to have to run it on an instance that's designed for it. So GPU or Trainium, or in French here, something that's designed for it. But when it comes to running the services and the networking and everything, it is just software. So as long as you can bundle that software into a package that you can deploy, and you can put the correct hardware in place, then that makes things like outposts and this kind of military specific one possible. And the future is just, you can't predict it.
Yeah, it's going to be amazing to think about the type of hardware. And like I said, that line between what is, we often think about it as either giant data centers somewhere in Virginia or wherever, or end user computing. But there's things in the middle, like outposts, would give us very low latency connections to these services.
But you see, even things like local zones now. So being able to say, I've got an application that I need to run. I need to run it on an EC2 instance, but it has to be super close to my users. And I know in one of the other ambassadors gave a lightning talk yesterday about local zones, and was talking about how he tested it in his kind of home country of New Zealand in comparison to the closest fully fledged region, which is Sydney. And the latency to the local zone in Auckland, I think it was less than half of what the latency was to Sydney. So if you have got those super latency sensitive applications, whether it's like remote workstations, then actually AWS are doing an awful lot to try and bring that data closer to you.
Yeah, so whether it's gaming or, like I said, remote work, or anything where you really, really want that low latency application, that's really neat that AWS, you're not locked into just the big regions. There's local zones and other things you can do to mitigate this latency requirement.
Even the stuff like wavelength as well is something that I keep coming across, where you can deploy private 5G networks into like a factory and have your IoT devices. So if you've got a factory that has no way of getting an internet connection to it, you can deploy this 5G network so things can communicate with each other.
Did they talk about that at the ambassador meeting?
They didn't.
I'm so curious what the use case is that versus a Wi-Fi installation, but obviously a huge amount of work has gone into it. I'd love to know like what the trade-offs are of private 5G versus a private 802.11 network.
I guess it's probably scale, I would imagine, in that a 5G network can naturally scale significantly further, being radio wave based rather than kind of Wi-Fi. Whereas Wi-Fi, you're ultimately going to get some degradation somewhere, whether it's cable length, whether it's repeating Wi-Fi signals. 5G is going to be designed for bigger spaces. But I also wonder whether they could do things like everyone knows that when you go to a sports stadium, the moment you try and use your phone at half time, you can't do anything because everyone's doing the same thing. You're all connecting to the same cell tower. Whether there's use cases for private 5G there for telcos to actually extend their network to just the confines of a stadium, maybe.
Well, I think we both remember at AWS London, that was one of the frustrating things. You tried to make a LinkedIn post, and you're like, oh, come on. That was incredible how bogged down that network got. So there's a lot of physical considerations, especially when you get 20,000 tech-oriented people all trying to use high bandwidth versions, right? It's not the typical
same
use
with like
case.
reInvent keynotes. Is if you're not connected to Wi-Fi before you go in, you're not connecting to the Wi-Fi.
Wow, yeah, I hadn't even thought of that. Right, I'd imagine every year it's a scaling issue, right? And now, okay, do you want to watch it in 4K?
Yep.
That's a whole lot more
it's
bits to move around.
Whenever I go to reInvent, it's because so many people travel internationally, and everyone defaults to like the roaming networks. So those get throttled so badly that I end up getting like a local SIM card so that I can use like T-Mobile.
That's a good idea.
And then get fully fledged 5G.
Okay, so rather than some MVNO has kind of second tier bandwidth. And
you pay like $30 for 100 gigs or something that will last you 30 days, and that's more than enough for a week in Vegas.
Yep, that makes sense. Let's take a 30-second break. I'm going to just double check some of the recordings and then let's keep going. I liked how you got on the subject of evangelism and talked about how you first started evangelizing internally. And so what was that like, and what were the reactions, and what were kind of what was that like in such a risk-averse environment?
It was hard. It's BT being I'm sure it's not just BT. I think any large company, especially when you're dealing with data that's sensitive.
Yes, we're talking telecoms, banks,
healthcare, any government, anything like that. The challenge was often convincing people that cloud can be secure enough. And the way I tried to pitch it was, you haven't got to make cloud secure enough for your most sensitive data, because it can't be secure enough for that data. So don't try and find a way to make it that sensitive or that secure even. Of course, you can store incredibly sensitive data in the cloud, but some things governments just won't sign off on, which is fair enough. So then it's pitching it in a way to say, actually, we can use the cloud in different ways. We can use it to reduce the cost of development. We can use it to speed up development. harbor experimentation in an organization. Lots of different ways that you can use cloud. But the challenge, I think, was most that because people hadn't thought of it in this way, it was always red tape. It was always a case of, well, we don't really know. We don't really know how to control the costs. Like, how do I get sign off for this if I can't tell you how much I'm going to spend on it? Which, of course, is a problem that most people face when they try and convince people to use cloud in an organization.
Well, it seems pretty reasonable, right? How do you write an unbounded check for something? Mm-hmm. And I like what you said about how you do want to meet people where they're at in terms of their doubts, because one approach is to say, "Oh, come on, this is easy for the cloud, right? This is no problem. It's been done many times before." But then you have to take these concerns seriously, because they said these here HIPAA violations carry like personal criminal liability, so you don't want to mess this up. And so you can take the one approach is to say, "Okay, come on, this is easy. This is a done deal." But then you have to. That's not going to win over any hearts and minds.
And I think it's whenever you look at anything in terms of cloud adoption, it's always this whole people, process, and technology kind of trio. And the technology is never the hard one. Process, it's harder. It's harder to get kind of the things in place to say, okay, we're used to deploying it in this way. We're used to release cycles every 6 months. Now we're doing it every 6 days. So that's difficult. But winning over people to start that process is, I think, always going to be the hardest part. Especially you have things like, as we said, finance teams who are used to saying, okay, here's a $100,000 check to go and buy a load of servers, but they won't necessarily authorize here's $100,000 budget that you might have to exceed in the cloud, because the whole point of the cloud is that it's variable. If you use more, you can spend more. If you want to spend less, you have to use less. And I think that makes people uncomfortable a lot of the time. And I think it's where things like forecasting come in, and the importance of updating forecasts regularly. So again, another lightning talk from an ambassador this week. A guy named Frank. He runs the FinOps podcast, and he was talking about the best way to do a forecast, and the kind of the most important thing that came out of that talk was the ability to continually update forecasts. So actually building that trust with your finance team to say, okay, well, our forecast at the very, very start of this process was X $1,000. This has changed. This is why. And now we're expecting that the forecast will be this. And just keep that like loop going, because they might not be happy that you're spending more money, but they'll at least appreciate you giving them a heads up rather than it being a get to the end of the month and the bill's 10 times higher.
I've definitely found that in my history as a consultant, and even just in day-to-day life, right? If there's ever a big reveal moment, you've messed up, right? It should always be this continuously updated expectations. It's not this here's the check at the end.
Exactly.
That's kind of fun, dramatic flair, but very rarely in a business environment.
People
works.
like to be in the know.
Yeah, and I love what you said about it's process and people. A reminder.
Some tools just find AWS cost savings and make you do all the work. Visualizing cost opportunities is great, but that's not enough. CloudFix, on the other hand, actually delivers those savings for you. And you don't need to worry because CloudFix is AWS recommended and easy to use. It's the only tool that fixes cost-saving opportunities and not just fines. It's the easiest way to save money on AWS. It's all 100% automatic and risk-free. And the best part of all, it works non-stop. Stop overspending on AWS and click on the button to start saving now.
Oh, sorry about that. Um, looks like I was on mute. Yeah, it seems like part two is having a bit of an issue. I'm going to put the stream on mute for about 2 minutes while I just figure out what's going on there. So I will be right back. Apologies for this.
One of the other ambassadors gave a lightning talk yesterday about local zones and was talking about how he tested it in his kind of home country of New Zealand in comparison to the closest fully fledged region, which is Sydney. And the latency to the local zone in Auckland, I think it was less than half of what the latency was to Sydney. So if you have got those super latency sensitive applications, whether it's like remote workstations, then actually AWS are doing an awful lot to try and bring that data closer to you.
Yeah, so whether it's gaming or like I said, remote work or anything where you really, really want that low latency application, that's really neat that AWS, you're not locked into just the big regions. There's local zones and other things you can do to mitigate this latency requirement.
Even the stuff like wavelength as well is something that I keep coming across, where you can deploy private 5G networks into like a factory and have your IoT devices. So if you've got a factory that has no way of getting an internet connection to it, you can deploy this 5G network so things can communicate with each other.
Did they talk about that at the ambassador meeting?
They didn't.
I'm so curious of what the use case is that versus, a Wi-Fi installation, but obviously a huge amount of work has gone into it. I'd love to know like what the trade-offs are of private 5G versus a private 802.11 network.
I guess it's probably scale, I would imagine, in that a 5G network can naturally scale significantly further, being radio wave based rather than kind of Wi-Fi. Whereas Wi-Fi, you're ultimately going to get some degradation somewhere, whether it's cable length, whether it's repeating Wi-Fi signals. 5G is going to be designed for bigger spaces. But I also wonder whether they could do things like, everyone knows that when you go to a sports stadium, the moment you try and use your phone at half time, you can't do anything because everyone's doing the same thing. You're all connecting to the same cell tower. Whether there's use cases for private 5G there for telcos to actually extend their network to just the confines of a stadium, maybe.
Well, I think we both remember at AWS London, that was one of the frustrating things. You tried to make a LinkedIn post, and you're like, oh, come on. That was incredible how bogged down that network got. So there's a lot of physical considerations, especially when you get 20,000 tech-oriented people all trying to use high bandwidth versions, right? It's not the typical
same
use
with
case.
reInvent keynotes. Is if you're not connected to Wi-Fi before you go in, you're not connecting to the Wi-Fi.
Wow, yeah. hadn't even thought of that. Right? I'd imagine every year it's a scaling issue, right? And now, okay, do you want to watch it in 4K?
Yep.
That's a whole lot
Yeah,
more
it's
bits to move around.
whenever I go to reInvent, it's because so many people travel internationally, and everyone defaults to like the roaming networks. So those get throttled so badly that I end up getting like a local SIM card so that I can use like T-Mobile.
That's a good idea.
And then get fully fledged 5G.
Okay, so rather than some MVNO that's has kind of second tier bandwidth.
And you pay like $30 for 100 gigs or something that will last you 30 days, and that's more than enough for a week in Vegas.
Yep, that makes sense. Let's take a 30-second break. I'm going to just double check some of the recordings, and then let's keep going. I liked how you got on the subject of evangelism and talked about how you first started evangelizing internally. And so what was that like, and what were the reactions, and what were kind of the different, what was that like in such a risk-averse environment?
It was hard. It's BT being I'm sure it's not just BT. I think any large company, especially when you're dealing with data that's sensitive.
Yes, we're talking telecoms, banks,
healthcare, any government, anything like that. The challenge was often convincing people that cloud can be secure enough. And the way I tried to pitch it was, you haven't got to make cloud secure enough for your most sensitive data, because it can't be secure enough for that data. So don't try and find a way to make it that sensitive or that secure even. Of course, you can store incredibly sensitive data in the cloud, but some things governments just won't sign off on, which is fair enough. So then it's pitching it in a way to say, actually, we can use the cloud in different ways. We can use it to reduce the cost of development. We can use it to speed up development, harbor experimentation in the organization. Lots of different ways that you can use cloud. But the challenge, I think, was most that because people hadn't thought of it in this way, it was always red tape. It was always a case of, well, we don't really know. We don't really know how to control the costs. Like, how do I get a sign off for this if I can't tell you how much I'm going to spend on it? Which, of course, is a problem that most people face when they try and convince people to use cloud in an organization.
Well, it seems pretty reasonable, right? How do you write an unbounded check for something? And I like what you said about how you do want to meet people where they're at in terms of their doubts, because one approach is to say, oh, come on, this is easy for the cloud, right? This is no problem. It's been done many times before. But then you have to take these concerns seriously, because they said these, like, here HIPAA violations carry like personal criminal liability, so you don't want to mess this up. And so you can take the one approach is to say, okay, come on, this is easy. This is a done deal. But then you have to, that's not going to win over any hearts and minds.
And I think
Yeah, Mike. All right, sorry about that. I've diagnosed the issue with part 2 of the video. It will be ready in a few moments. So I thought that while that's just finishing up, let's double check the timer. Yeah, just a few more minutes. I thought that while that's finishing up, let's go over a few more of the what's new on AWS announcements and just have a look. So let me share my screen here. Present. And let's see. Here it is. Put that on the stage. We've got a few new, really interesting announcements here. One of them, there's 8 new EC2 bare metal instances. So these all look like the 7th gen 7th gen Intel instances. Let's have a look at this. So we've got M7i, C7i, R6i. Yep. Okay, so this is one of the really confusing nomenclature. it's 7th generation in terms of the EC2 instance. So that's why there's the 7. So in that particular series, so there's M1, M2, M3. But then it's the 4th generation of the Xeon Scalable. And this is only on AWS, 15% better performance. The R7IZ are the fastest Sapphire Rapids. So this is in direct competition to the Epic Genoa instances, which have been announced. I want to pull up actually an interesting M series blog post that I did. Let's see, CloudFix AMD. One moment here. Yeah, there's let me pull this blog post up. Here we go. Right sizing. I'm still looking for the blog post, but while we're waiting, I guess what it shows is that there's an evolution in the instance families. There's M1, M2, M3, M4, and then M5 really branched out into different M series types. And one of these, part of this is the M7 I, the Intel specific, and then there's M7A. If we look at the Intel announcement, let's look at the M7A announcement. Actually, the C7A just came out. So let's look at that EC2 C7A announcement. This is brand new as well. This is the C7A instance type powered by the 4th gen Epic Genoa, maximum frequency of 3.7 gigahertz. So you can get that, or the M7i, C7i, R7i by 4th generation Intel Xeon Scalable. So 3.9 gigahertz. So this is a real neck and neck competition between these two processors. You definitely have to evaluate what's better for your usage. We are partnered with AMD, so always try your workloads on AMD to see. Often the price performance is better, but then of course always you have to figure out what works best for your application. And also try Graviton. It all depends on the specifics of your application. But the great thing about the cloud, right? It's elastic. Little sneak preview of our reInvent talk, right? It's like Alanis Morissette song, "Isn't it elastic?" Don't you think? Yeah, it's elastic. So just try one, try the other. You're not locked in to one, and so you can do an A/B test on your workload, see what works to you. Now, these are interesting in these bare metal instances. So I guess the idea of a bare metal instance is that you don't need there's no overhead of the standard I guess the standard hypervisor. You have access to the bare metal machine. They're not subdivided, because typically how an EC2 instance works is, say the full instance is size 128x large, and then that gets chopped up into different bits, like say a 64 and 16s and another 16, and it gets bin packed depending on what size instances are needed at the time. Well, that doesn't happen with metal. You have the entire machine. So if we look at the instance pricing, usually the metal cost is the same as the highest type. So let's look at EC2 instance pricing on demand. So let's have a look at the C7i metal. There we go. Okay, see, this is a metal 48x large and a metal 24x large. They must have two different physical machines that are different sizes. 192 vCPUs, a third of a terabyte of RAM, very impressive, and 50,000 megabit performance. So that is an incredible bit of networking hardware. Let's look at what else they're talking about with the metal here on this one. EC2 customers to run applications that benefit from deep performance analysis. So if you're doing computational simulations, specialized workloads that require direct access to bare metal, some of this is legacy. Yep, legacy workloads not supported in virtual environments. Licensing restricted business critical applications. And these are some Intel specific things like data streaming accelerator, in-memory analytics. accelerator. So if you're trying to debug an application that has a very particular memory profile, you want to make sure you understand exactly the RAM it's allocating. This is how you do it. So let's see. They are in US East North, US West. So this is US East 1 and US West 2. All right. Well, so have a look at this. And Raul's not here, so I get to do the rating all on my own. I'm going to give this. I like how they are giving the use cases for that. So I'm going to give this a 4. Now, in terms of does this simplify or add complexity, I think this is a neutral. I mean, certainly more choice is always good. So in that case, I would say this simplifies. At the same time, having these metal instances, we really want to move away from that abstraction if you can. I'm going to give this a neutral. Let's check on our export. Cool. Few more minutes on the part 2 export, but I'm Knuff. I can do this. All right. Let's do this. Next one on the what's new. Let's have a look. We talked about config last week. AWS SageMaker now supports geospatial processing job. Let's put this on screen. AWS SageMaker now supports geospatial processing jobs. So I'm going to put the link to this in the comments. Here we go. So you can follow along on the article. And then again, LinkedIn comments are not as well supported by they're not as well supported by StreamYard, so I have to put them in manually. There we go. All right. SageMaker now supports geospatial processing jobs. SageMaker now supports geospatial processing jobs, making it easier for data scientists and ML engineers to run planetary scale ML workloads. That is cool. We'll need a flexible compute cluster that can scale from tens of instances to process a city block to thousands of instances for planetary scale processing. So I don't know. Well, I guess this is how things like Pokemon Go, right? Which have this, the idea is that there's waypoints and you're wandering around the city looking around for them. And then they want to give machine learning based recommendations on what the next waypoint is or what the next thing you should go look for. Well, you want to have these predictions based on geospatial characteristics. So you draw these in the database, you have these polygons or shapes on a map, and you can do queries like select all players currently in Polygon, where Polygon could be, as it said, a city block or even a whole city, some meaningful geographic shape. So here we go with just a few lines of code. You can scale out your geospatial workloads with SageMaker processing jobs. You can specify a script that defines your workload, location of your geospatial data on S3, and the geospatial container. SageMaker processing provisions cluster resources for you to run city, country, or continent scale geospatial ML workloads. This looks interesting. Let's have a look at the geospatial ML. Build, train, and deploy ML models faster using geospatial data. So this is something that I'm not very much in depth. Okay, this is interesting. Satellite imagery, maps, location data. I think for people who are deeply into this field, I like how here they have a lot of different use cases. Oh, this is interesting. Satellite images for plant health. You know, a long time ago, I was helping a startup, or I was talking to a startup. We never got to an official relationship, advisory thing. And they had a camera inside of a box that had some sticky paper. And the idea was you'd put this camera with sticky paper in a box into a field, and say you were growing apples. Well, apples are very susceptible to aphids. And so occasionally some aphids would get stuck in the sticky paper, and the camera would then have like a silhouette of the aphid. And it would run machine learning to determine what bugs and how many bugs were in the field based on the silhouette of the bugs that it captured in the sticky paper. And it can combine that with other conditions that are geospatial, like the proximity to water. For example, bugs breed it near water. So the idea is you could figure out how many bugs are there. So this is some interesting geospatial ML use cases. So looking at the article itself, I mean, it gives good example. Well, I guess it leans on the web page for examples. I'm going to give this a 3.5. I'd really like to know more about the scale and also something about cost. And also, what are the alternative ways of doing it? How are people doing it before this came out? So I'm going to give this 3.5 for that. I do think it's a simplifies. If you can, machine learning workloads tend to become Rube Goldberg machines. If you don't know that term, Rube Goldberg, look it up on YouTube. It's when you have, a ball falls down a flight of stairs and it hits a domino, and the dominoes topple over, and the last domino turns on a toaster oven, and the toast pops up, and it hits, I don't know, it hits something else, and it triggers another event and another event and another event. And that's what's called a Rube Goldberg machine. And there's competitions to see how long you can make these Rube Goldberg machines. Now, machine learning tasks, because you're bringing in lots of different data from lots of different places, it tends to be a computational Rube Goldberg machine, in that there's a lot of different steps that you want to bring in. So having it in one platform or less platforms, less places to be, that can be really helpful. So that, in that case, I'll give a simplifies. Shalon, love a good Rube. Also, yeah, they're really fun. They're impressive to see them set up. All right, let's have a quick check on part 2. Ooh, look, we've got 2 minutes. So we've got time for one more article, and then we will be back for part 2 with Alex Kearns. Let's have a look. QuickSight launches custom total for table and pivot table, custom total feature for tables and pivot tables. New functionality enhances user flexibility and streamlines the process of defining calculations. Let's see. Calculations such as sum, average, min, max, and none from a predefined list to compute totals in table and pivot table charts with straightforward one-click method from the user interface. So therefore, you don't need to create intricate calculation formulas for accurate data retrieval at both the row level and total calculation. This is cool. So this is the idea of QuickSight, and what I like about this is that it's accessible via CloudFormation. So the idea is with QuickSight, as you're doing a dashboard, you want to summarize data. You have data coming in, you want to summarize it, but you also want to perform these calculations like sum, average, min, max. And then for pivot tables, the idea is you are summing across a category. So say you have you want websites by region over every region. Well, this seems like it'll be very useful to do that. Let's look at the further details page. QuickSight authors can define the total and subtotal aggregations for their table or pivot table visuals from the field wells. For tables, the custom total menu is only available if the totals are toggled for the visual. So I think the only thing I'd worry about is, I think this particular feature is really, really, really good. There's always the worry that as you add more and more and more features, you start to have larger and larger overlaps of where things should exist, right? QuickSight is meant to be a visualization dashboarding tool. Obviously, there's going to be some summation and aggregation functions, but if it gets too complex, it will become, it might lose some of its simplicity, right? There's a trade-off between simplicity and complexity. I think on the whole, this simplifies, because if you need to do this calculation in your QuickSight dashboards and you don't have it supported, then you have to move the data somewhere else. You need to set up some pipeline to do it and then bring it back. So I'm going to give this a simplifies, and the article itself, I'm going to give it a 3 just because it's so short. It could use some examples. So I'm giving it a 3 and a simplifies. All right, let's check on our export. Oh, look that. It has 30 seconds to go. So again, apologies for that. We've got part 2 coming up in 30 seconds. It's funny, speaking about the metal instances and their 50,000 megabits per second of bandwidth. So right now I've got the videos that render and they go to my NAS. It's good rendering on the computer behind me, but then we'll go to the NAS on my desk here and will be played by the computer that I'm talking to you through right now. And that's all 1 gigabit networking, which is impressive. I mean, for a long time we had 10 base T, right? So that was 2 orders of magnitude slower, right? So it would take 10 seconds, would take 1,000 seconds. So it's incredible where we got to where gigabit is now a home standard. 10 gigabit is considered like the very high end of a home setup, but 50,000, so I guess it would be 50 gigabit connections. I've never seen even what the hardware looks like for that. That's different wiring. That's not Cat 8. That's going to be SDI or something like that, or fiber, some type of fiber link. I would love to see what that's like and interact with that, and just the sizes of the data sets that you can move around on a 50,000 megabit connection. And it's amazing that there's a lot more than just the networking hardware, because you actually have to have somewhere to put that data where you can write that fast. Otherwise, I mean, the data has to have somewhere to go, right? So if you're transferring a lot of data, your hard disk has to be able to write as fast as the data from the network card can be supplied, or it gets loaded up into RAM, but that is finite. Although with these metal instances, 384 gigabytes of RAM, that is plenty of room. So say you had a 100 gigabyte matrix that you wanted to load into memory, you could transfer that over the network at 50,000 megabits per second. So what would 100, I wonder if Google could figure that out. Time to transfer 100 GB at 50,000 megabits per second. Oh, I see. We got to use the file time transfer calculator. Let's put this on screen. I always wonder about this stuff. All right, file time transfer calculator. Say you have 100 gigabytes and your transfer rate. Oh, see, it won't even go up that way. Okay, so this will take you 14 minutes. And so imagine that being 1/50th of that. So 14 minutes in seconds, that's going to be 14 times 60. That's 840 seconds. Now divided by 50 is going to be 16.8 seconds. So 16.8 seconds to transfer 100 gigabytes. That's phenomenal. That's what a cool thing that we have access to. So remember, whenever you're choosing your instances, we tend to look at CPU and memory, but it's also the EBS bandwidth. It's the networking. So that, please take that into consideration. All right. Here is Alex Kearns part 2. I believe that just finished exporting. Let's have a look at this. I want to make sure I share the right one here. View details. Perfect. Okay. Alex Kearns part 2. Let's share this out. Just double check some of the recordings and then let's keep going. I liked how you got on the subject of evangelism and talked about how you first started evangelizing internally. Mm-hmm. And so what was that like, and what were the reactions, and what were kind of the different, what was that like in such a risk-averse environment?
It was hard. It's BT being I'm sure it's not just BT. I think any large company, especially when you're dealing with data that's sensitive.
Yes, we're talking telecoms, banks,
healthcare, any government.
Oh, I think we were a little bit further ahead. I'm just going to fast forward
like
here.
The challenge was often, so that's difficult, but winning over people to start that process is, I think, always going to be the hardest part. especially you have things like, as we said, finance teams who are used to saying, okay, here's a $100,000 check to go and buy a load of servers, but they won't necessarily authorize here's $100,000 budget that you might have to exceed in the cloud, because the whole point of the cloud is that is variable. If you use more, you can spend more. If you want to spend less, you have to use less. And I think that makes people uncomfortable a lot of the time. And I think it's where things like forecasting come in, and the importance of
This is where we were.
of updating forecasts regularly. So again, another lightning talk from an ambassador this week. A guy named Frank. He runs the FinOps podcast, and he was talking about the best way to do a forecast, and the kind of the most important thing that came out of that talk was the ability to continually update forecasts. So actually building that trust with your finance team to say, okay, well, our forecast at the very, very start of this process was X $1,000. This has changed. This is why. And now we're expecting that the forecast will be this, and just keep that like loop going, because they might not be happy that you're spending more money, but they'll at least appreciate you giving them a heads up rather than it being a get to the end of the month and the bill's 10 times higher.
I've definitely found that in my history as a consultant, and even just in day-to-day life, right? If there's ever a big reveal moment, you've messed up, right? It should always be this continuously updated expectations. It's not this here's the check at the end.
Exactly.
That's kind of fun, dramatic flair, but very rarely in a business environment.
People
works.
like to be in the know.
Yeah, and I love what you said about it's process and people. I'm reminded of several different guests who kind of iterated the same thing. Steph Gooch was on our show a couple of weeks ago. She said the same thing. It's never the tech, it's people.
Yep.
And getting them aligned. And I'm glad you brought up process as well. There's this book I read a long time ago when I was in the healthcare field called Digital Doctor, and they were trying to build this this great dashboard for the nurses to use for their deployment. And so previously they had like a green, a yellow, and a red folder on this table, and the nurses knew when there's a red folder that was a high priority case, and they'd pick it up, open it up, and then grab it and go. And they brought in these people to build this great new dashboard, and they could replace this wall of folders with this screen. They found out that this red folder was such a good visual cue that no one actually used the dashboard. And so what they ended up doing was just putting an empty red folder whenever there was something high priority, just that would then trigger the nurses to look at the dashboard.
And that's why I think it's so important when customers do work with a partner, or whether they work on their own, or whatever they want to do in terms of adopting cloud or undertaking a big project in cloud. It's the technical bit can be learned, it can be taught. You can go online, you can learn kind of this is how to do X, Y, Z in AWS. That's okay. What often you can't get online is somebody coming in and saying, okay, well, if you change this and you replace this service with this service, and you start breaking up the organization like this, have you thought about this? And I guess it's a role that maybe is more aligned to kind of business consultants and management consultants a bit. Management consultants obviously get a questionable rap given to them, but that I think is what every cloud consultant needs to be thinking about as well. They need to be thinking about not just, okay, I'm going to come in, I'm going to build this thing for customer, I'm going to get out. It should be, okay, this journey you're going on. At some point, yes, you're going to get the technical infrastructure, you're going to get the thing that is the shiny bit you want, but if we leave before you know either how to use it or before it's integrated into your business process, before your finance teams know how to handle bills, before your security team know that this is now where they're looking for vulnerabilities. They're not waiting for kind of, it's not a report you run once a month. It's you're going to get your data there and then. That part is the thing I think that we see lacking in a lot of cases, especially when customers have tried to perhaps do things themselves, built something, and it's like it works, and then people aren't using it.
That sounds like a lot of hard-won experience to get there, and it definitely, it's easy when you start as a consultant to get so excited about the tech and say, okay, we could rip this all down and rebuild it really quick for you, but you can't do that. You have to take into account and gradually shift people along, and that's, like I said, it's a journey. It's not just this you swap like for like, and maybe that works on the tech side, but the people and the process part is gonna flounder if you don't bring those along too.
And I think there's this real dangerous thing with the cloud where engineers don't think about cost. So just like there's all this rage of shifting left with security, so turning DevOps into DevSecOps and kind of whatever amalgamation you want to use. Really, there should be not just security shifting left, but also responsibility for cost shifting left as well. So a developer shouldn't be spinning up an EC2 instance without thinking, okay, this is going to cost $100 a month. Is that justifiable for what I'm putting on it? Should I be looking at building it in a different way? Normally, we find that actually it's a case of people build things and then cost doesn't get looked at until cost becomes a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And then you end up with a case where you've got this big estate of IT, it's costing too much, but all of your applications are built in a non-optimized way. So you have to spend more money to migrate them into something that is optimized.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and it goes against somewhat traditional engineering because, like, okay, being in Seattle, we're really close to Boeing, and something you talk to the old Boeing engineers about, and they were hidden the details of cost because they didn't want them to think about cost. They wanted to think about the safety and reliability, and then cost was someone else's issue to make it work at the end of the day. But with cloud, you can really, I mean, I guess in the Boeing case, that there's an upper bound, right?
Yep.
You can't. There's an upper bound to how much you can make something cost, but in cloud there really isn't.
There is not, no.
Right. There's nothing that stops you from starting up a 112x large, one of those SAP HANA instances, and saying, "Oh, I want to, I don't know, do whatever I want on this."
But again, there's just such little things that can cause problems. So again, another lightning talk, and this shows the importance of these kind of events, was given, and the title of the talk was around $1 million lines of code. And they kind of showed examples of things like, okay, if you put a debug logger inside a for loop, and that for loop is running millions, billions, trillions of times over the course of a year, if someone from ops turns on debugging to try and figure out what's going wrong and forgets to turn it off again, if you end up with trillions of logs in CloudWatch and you haven't got controls in place, then you are that one choice to put that log statement in there, or that one choice to not protect against people turning debugging on and forgetting to turn it off again, is going to cost you potentially millions of dollars over the course of a year. And it's so easy to I guess prematurely optimize, but also to just be quite nonchalant about it and think, well, it's a Lambda, it's costing me fractions of a cent every second.
Yeah, it's just a tiny little JSON blob coming into my CloudWatch. What do I care? One of our big cloud fix finder fixers is duplicate CloudTrail logs. And so with CloudTrail, the first management event is free to store. And so you might as well just store all of them once and then mine it later. You can always filter your data later. But what happens is someone says, okay, I really want to monitor S3. And so they'll start another CloudTrail, which just monitors S3 events. And it's easy. All your stuff's in one place. But now you're paying for a redundant copy of the event. And with S3 or with key management really populates CloudTrail logs. And you can, if you want to store a couple copies of all your key management, get ready to pay for it.
Absolutely. I know there was something interesting that the AWS said. One of the security team said on Tuesday afternoon was around what AWS are doing to optimize costs. So typically, I mean, I can't think of the last time I saw a service get more expensive other than the recent IP addresses one. Obviously, you get new instances, you get different variations, but in terms of core service offerings, prices tend to either reduce or stay where they are, which is incredibly hard, I think, to implement. But one of the examples that they gave was actually they can make improvements to things like guard duty, for example, and security hub, where they're scanning so many different types of logs. But for example, with the CloudTrail log that the guard duty might scan, a lot of the events in it aren't actually relevant to what guard duty needs. So before they scan those events, they filter out the ones that aren't relevant, so that as the customer, you're not paying for the scanning of those. So that's not something that a customer would normally see, but evidence of the things that AWS are doing to try and keep costs low while still improving services and adding functionality. And yeah, I'm sure there are other cases as well within the ecosystem where they have to do very similar things.
Well, just thinking about Compute Optimizer, right? We could actually get data-driven right-sizing recommendations for your EC2 instances. They just launched Compute Optimizer for GPU-based instances, which is a huge cost driver if you're doing any machine learning. And they do really want to help you get your value out of your spend. And it's partially for this long-term customer relations, but also because all of that unlocked value is going to go right back into, well, right now, generative AI, right? Any budget you free up from running EC2 instances that are too big, you're going to put it into Bedrock or SageMaker and do some fun projects with that.
I always think it's really unintuitive with cost optimization, because people look at it and think, okay, why are Amazon helping me spend less money with them? Surely that's detrimental to their business. But actually, you have to think of it as, if you're a large customer and the cloud is costing too much, then your choices are you save money on cloud or you don't use the cloud. One of those results in no AWS spend, and one of them results in better trust with your cloud provider and longer term customer value, because you will get back to that spend, because you will grow and you will get back to where that original point was. And I think that's where people sometimes associate cost optimization with cost reduction, and it isn't always the case. Price to performance ratios are a massive thing. So yes, you might pay the same for a Graviton instance as you would for an Intel instance, but your Graviton one might be twice as powerful. So you kind of getting more for your money. And that, I think, is the real key. Is for some customers, cost reduction is super important. For other customers, we don't need to save money, but in order to carry on growing at this pace, we need to make better use of every dollar we're spending.
Yeah, and to have that feeling of value that they're really getting out what they're putting in, or getting out more than what they're putting in, so they feel like it's a good investment in the long term. That's really neat. So you told me that Gen AI was a big focus of the Ambassador. Tell us about that. What is or what can you say about it?
What can I say about it? That is a good question. So I think everybody knows that generative AI is a massive hot topic at the moment. It's the buzz that's going around the cloud industry. Every cloud provider is doing something with it. Obviously, Bedrock was announced earlier this year in very, very limited preview with select partners. We are not one of them, so I haven't seen Bedrock. Those people that have seen Bedrock can't share Bedrock. And I know that those partners that have had access to Bedrock, when they've only just been able to say, we've had access to it. And the statements that are published have had to go through AWS marketing, AWS legal, before anything is said about it, which is understandable.
So they're keeping some control over the messaging.
And it is the way I think that it's being seen is that it is a kind of almost once in a generation type shift in the way that things are being done. I tend to lean on the more skeptical side of things. I think generative AI has massive potential, and the concepts behind generative AI are not new. Neural networks, large language models have been around for a long, long time. What has changed is the availability of data and the availability of compute. That's been the spark that's caused this. I think we will absolutely be seeing loads and loads and loads of generative AI stuff coming from Amazon. I'm sure there is plenty that they have not even told us, even under NDA. And I think it's a fairly safe bet that we know that reInvent this year, even looking at the session catalog already, is fairly Gen AI heavy. It's an interesting topic to try and relate to every type of business. So the feeling I'm leaving Seattle with is Amazon are really focusing on this thing. So as a partner, we should be doing the same thing. But it does make you think, once we're over this kind of peak in the hype cycle, once you kind of get into that, what is it called? The trough of trough of disillusionment, they call it, don't they? You kind of get over that peak of everyone's hyped about it, the necessary thing to advance it, of everyone building crazy things with it, into that bit where people are like, I've heard enough of this now. I've heard so much about it. It's just something else. And then you kind of go up and it evens out and becomes just a bit of a kind of stable thing in the ecosystem. And the way I'm currently thinking about it is, you think back a number of years when kind of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and those things exploded onto the scene. And at the time, everyone was like, yeah, this is game changing. In 10 years, we're all going to be buying things with digital cryptocurrency. And here we are still buying things in cash. So I tend to lean on the more skeptical side. However, I can see great potential for it in certain areas.
What you're saying reminded me of this YouTube short I saw with Neil deGrasse Tyson about his predictions for 2050, where he's like, okay, generative AI will be here. It will be a positive and useful part of our lives. It will still be controlled by humans. Yeah. You know, Skynet will not have taken over. And we'll figure out what it's good at and what it's not good at. Yeah. And so being able to use it as a supplement, but hopefully it's not in charge of killer robots or anything
And I
like
think
that.
that's where you look at what's available now. So things like Code Whisperer, for example, it's there as an aid. It's not there. It's never going to replace a developer. It's there to do the heavy lifting for you, to do that, to basically get you started. And I think I'd view a lot of generative AI as the same things. So if, for example, if you're writing a blog and you think, okay, I sort of know roughly what I want to say, and you always end up spending sort of 2 or 3 hours just putting a bit of a structure in place. If you could write a prompt that said, I want to talk about these things, just put a bit of a structure in place to get me started, it might give you 4 or 5 paragraphs and then you fill the rest out. So I think that it, in its current form, is still going to be there to help, just to get you started. It's anything like that. But I don't think it will take long for it to become very advanced.
Well, and what I like, and I guess going back to the evangelism, and at the core of evangelism, I see just teaching. And I think one thing that we need to get used to, and I'm thinking back to the days where I was a statistics teacher, is this idea of having this layer of uncertainty and probabilisticness kind of being baked into every layer of what we do, where it's not saying we're going to have these concrete rules that will always be right or wrong, but on average, these things are going to get better over time, and we're going to understand the risk-reward trade-offs that are associated with those things. And I think that's part of what the maturation of how do we use generative AI is getting, and part of the evangelism that needs to happen is getting us humans used to thinking in terms of probabilistic results and probabilistic outputs, and things will be good on average.
I think one of the biggest issues at the moment is understandability of it and transparency of it. So a large language model is a black box, essentially. You put something in, something comes out, but there's no real way to understand what's going on inside, because it is just so complex. I mean, some of these models with like 200 billion parameters going into them, you're never going to understand it, as we are at the moment anyway. So that's where you look at, I think, what's kind of being termed kind of conventional AI or old style AI is still going to be so important for use cases like, I don't know, fraud detection, where you need to kind of be able to understand, if I've put this input in, this is why it's made this decision. Naturally, machine learning is always going to be not going to be deterministic. It's not going to guarantee you the same result every time, because otherwise, why would you have machine learning?
Well, and that's in contrast to like an old traditional statistical model where you'd have all of your factors and you say, okay, this factor contributes this much, and you can understand for a given new data point what the model is going to output. But yeah, getting used to that world of, we don't really understand what's going on. But then it is funny that trust issue of, okay, well, I should have a human do it, but then do we understand how humans work either? Well, not really.
Exactly. Yeah, it's this, the idea of conscious and unconscious bias exists in humans and in machine learning. The difference is, in machine learning, you potentially pick up some of the developer's bias as well, because whoever's building it is probably the person selecting the data. And if they select data that's skewed towards a particular, I don't know if it's something to do with people, it could be towards a particular demographic or anything like that, then your model is going to be as biased as the person building it is.
Yeah, that's going to be some really sensitive territory that's going to have to be navigated, and it's it's tricky to understand how that's going to play out. But hopefully, again, that comes down to the role of evangelism and just taking it at a slow and steady pace, and not giving it the reins to, I don't know, mission critical systems just yet.
Exactly. That's evangelism plays multiple roles in everything regarding AWS, and I think one really interesting piece of evangelism that I've had to try and adapt to in this new role, I suppose, is putting more of a focus on how do you evangelize a people company, a consultancy, because yourself working for a SaaS company, you've got a product, there are developers that use that product. As an evangelist, you can evangelize to those developers using it, being that conduit for helping them make the most of it. When you're a consultancy, there's not that software product as such. So I kind of have to wear two hats, in that I have to evangelize AWS to say, to start with, you should be using AWS rather than being on premises or using Azure or GCP. But then secondly, it's evangelizing, okay, why should I engage Ubertas Consulting?
Got it. So just for kind of setting the context, so we're at your current role, you are the AWS Ambassador, Principal Solutions Architect, Ubertas Consulting.
Yep.
And there's an evangelism component to the AWS Ambassador role, but then also obviously going hand in hand with your role with Ubertas.
Yep.
So how does that work? So what are you evangelizing? And what are the different, I suppose, how does it all come together?
So I think the AWS part is probably the easier part, because it's not just me. I'm not the only person kind of fighting this battle. Any way you look online, you'll see good, you'll see bad stories about AWS. So when I have to evangelize AWS, it's normally quite closely linked to the AWS things that we offer. So migration, modernization, well architected, anything in that kind of arena. Evangelizing the consultancy side is where it gets more tricky. And for me, it's all about people. So we are a small, tight-knit team, obviously aspirations to scale, but at the moment we are a team of kind of just over 20 people. And for me, evangelizing that means customers actually knowing their architect. So it's things like, how do you help get people in the company writing blog posts? So evangelizing doesn't necessarily mean me producing content. It actually means for those individuals that are going to be engaging with customers, how do we get their faces there as well? How do we get to a point where it almost feels like, the way I described it in a meeting this morning was, we want to be that trusted advisor. We want to have customers feel confident they've got a face to go to. And if we can get as many faces as possible writing blogs, doing public speaking, doing this kind of thing, for me, that is how to evangelize a consultancy. It's your product is the people. The thing that sets us apart from other partners is having the best consultants. And our customers love our people, so we need to find ways to make sure that it's not just about the delivering results, because you pick 10 partners out of a lineup and every partner is going to have a case study that says, we did this, we did this, we did this, the outcome is this. what a lot of partners don't do very well, and we still have work to do on it, is talking about actually those people involved. So saying, okay, this person was the architect on this project, and let's actually have something that's not faceless. Let's have them do a video or something. Let's have a piece to camera where it's human. It gives something more than just facts and figures to an engagement.
No, I really like what you're saying about how it is a very personal thing, and I think I have this theory that as so much of the world gets digital, the people part matters more, right? Because when it was all people and there was nothing else, that was just kind of the substrate of the background. But now there's so much that's digital and transactional, that the actual relationships and being able to call someone and even just get a feel of who they are and what's their ethos behind designing something. It's a really important part of the decision. And consulting, and I've been on both sides of it, having hired consultants and also having been a consultant. It's a really tricky business, right? Because you're often dealing with a couple of different stakeholders at the same time who have very different expectations of you, and you have to get everyone in the same room, on the same page, often speaking the same vocabulary. Some people might be more enthusiastic about you being there than others. Some people might not have a choice in the matter. And to get everyone, at the end of the day, satisfied that you're there and that you get paid, expectations are set on time, but you still get the actual project. There's a lot of moving parts there.
I think so much of it just comes down to being friendly and being seen as approachable. So one thing that we try really hard to do is not just to be that consultancy that comes in, delivers some work, and then disappears. We want every relationship to be long term, both for obviously business growth reasons, because who wouldn't want a long relationship, but also for the customer to really get their value from having access to consultants. That needs to be as much as possible a relationship with a person they know. So of course you can't always guarantee it. People join, people leave, but life is what it is. But certainly when it comes to building trust with customers, it's so nice to be able to have the ability for a customer to kind of pick up the phone and say, here's a problem. I'd really like to be able to speak to whoever, because I've worked with them before, and they're the person that I think knows my stuff best. And it's an interesting problem to try and solve as we scale, because as we get bigger and bigger, it's going to be harder to have people kind of sitting on projects, but then also maybe being available for helping prior customers. But that's where we're trying to invest in some automation to do the bits that there's not any real value in a human doing. So, for example, those customers who we resell AWS to get access to a portal which surfaces various bits of information in one place, one of which is kind of simplifying the output of things like compute optimizer. Just as like a kind of, did you know you could save this much? And surfacing results from their previous well-architected reviews. Those things that actually, there's not a lot of value in an expensive solutions architect sitting there for a few hours and pulling that together into a standard format. Where we want to add value is the conversation that follows, to say, actually, okay, you've identified this, you want to save some money, now let's get it done.
And that trusted advisor role is, one of the benefits of being a consultant or being in my position, where we get to look at a lot of different accounts, and you get this more general perspective. Whereas if you were at one company, you are, necessarily, that's the one perspective you see on things, and sometimes, just out of either not knowing better or just through evolution, you can go down a weird path. And by being able to see lots of different projects and lots of different companies at different stages and seeing how things evolve in general, it's really a neat perspective to have. And then to be able to take that to customers and say, here's where you are in the maturity curve, and here's what the next 6 months to a year should look like. We had a guy, Rick Ox, who he owns Compute Optimizer, and he was telling us some customers got really worried when they were at 10% utilization on their EC2, and he goes, no, 10% is actually pretty good. Like the average across large enterprises is like 6% CPU utilization on EC2. So 10%'s great. I guess being able to give them that confidence. Okay, you've seen other industries at certain points. Here's how this is going to evolve over time. That's a really neat piece of perspective to give, right? Because when you're in one project, you're in the weeds, and you don't know what everyone else is doing.
I think that's where the experience comes in, and you see the best of the best and the worst of the worst, and being able to sort of translate those technical things into business things, I think is a really crucial skill that an awful lot of people in tech don't do very well at. So there's this idea of kind of emotional intelligence and EQ that got brought up over the last couple of days, and I think it's such an important thing, especially in consulting, because you can be the best developer in the world, but as a consultant, if you can't explain to the customer how something works in potentially the simplest of terms, if they're maybe they're a business or finance stakeholder who have no idea about tech, they just need to know what is the benefits, how much it's going to cost. If you can't distill something very technical into terms that anybody can understand, then I don't think a consultant is probably the role that they should be in.
I really like that perspective, and knowing what people want out of it. Because like you said, there's people who just want the bottom line. There's other people. I wrote down a list of personas that I used to meet in consulting. There's some who are enthusiasts, who are tech enthusiasts, who are usually not necessarily on the business side. They just think it's cool, and they want to be able to play with it as part of their day job. There's others who, like you said, they're in more of the business side. They want to care about the bottom line. They don't really care how it gets done. And then there's the skeptics of, that's exactly like what we built 6 months ago. Yeah. Why do we need this? And you understand why that exists. And then there's, I suppose, more like the cost, or even some who are more territorial, right? Where it's okay, this is great. Don't touch my database. My database is staying right here under my desk on this physical server.
It's a really hard skill to learn, and the way that I would normally pitch this is, and the reason I'll say this is because I know she'll watch this when it gets published, is I like in interviews to be able to say to someone, here's this super complex tech topic. Now, explain it to me like I'm your grandma. And she won't mind me saying that because she is quite au fait with tech. But having that ability to just take something super complex and explain it to someone like they are your grandma or someone who's not very technical. For me, that is what makes a good consultant, is being able to explain and adjust the language to suit who you're speaking to.
No, I love it. So I guess we're thinking about the consulting. So what are the different, I suppose, phases of maturity of different companies you've seen, and then do you do more greenfield projects or lift and shift? Or tell us about the different types of projects that you do, and just your experience with that of helping people in their cloud journey.
So we kind of see all sorts. So at the moment, we are kind of up to now have been very focused on the SMB space. So kind of got a really good relationship within AWS, kind of fairly well regarded by them as SMB in the UK, sort of partner of choice almost. So from that perspective, it's really great. The next step is to try and figure out, okay, how do we jump from SMB into starting to get into some enterprises, and that's all work in progress. That's a big thing for going into next year, is how we look at that. In terms of type of projects, there's a variety. We do a lot of migrations, so lift and shift typically, then leading on to kind of modernization work, either immediately following or later. Tend to try and do things in a sort of two-phase approach if possible, just because it's easier to modernize once you've got things working in the cloud than it is to do everything kind of one big bang and risk having to kind of debug and fix things.
So you're not going to say, let's re-architect into serverless from your existing on-prem, right? That sounds fun, right? Everyone likes starting a fresh project, but that's a hard sell, and it's probably not a good idea either, right? You want to give people a chance to get familiar with, okay, how do I access an EC2 instance versus an on-prem instance? How do you manage keys and credentials? Even just a little, I suppose, ergonomics of working with the cloud. How do you change the deployment pipelines so that everyone's still happy that their code can ship and that they have ownership over that process? And then, like you said, then you start saying, okay, well, where can I transition maybe the database over to a managed database, or the cache over to a managed cache?
And for me, at scale, probably as far as we would normally go in one jump is maybe, let's say you've got something running on premises, it's a MySQL database or Postgres database, then that probably would be migrated into Aurora or RDS. Sometimes you go for applications into, say, ECS, and sort of do that modernization at the same time to an extent. I'm personally not the biggest fan of going like from legacy app on premise to Lambda in one fell swoop, because unless you're doing kind of particular patterns, so I know there's patterns like kind of strangler fig, where you can move sort of pieces across one at a time, and slowly but surely you end up with just the core remaining and everything else around it having been modernized. But it sounds great in theory, but it's really hard to do successfully. So I think, for me, it's take things as steady as possible. They always say the kind of the triangle of what is it? Quick, quality, and cheap.
Yeah, which two do you want?
Which two do you want? So if you want to have something migrated for less money, and you want it migrated cheaply, then you're not going to get the full modernization journey at the same time. If you want to go on a 2-year program, and that 2-year program is going to get you from on-premises to fully serverless, microservices, the full works, then it's going to be great, but it's going to take a while and it ain't going to be cheap. So, yeah.
That's some really cool perspective. And like I said, I like that ultimate respect for the customer. They have to be part of that journey with you. So I really like that perspective you're bringing. The one thing we were talking about aviation,
Mhm.
and we talked about that outage that occurred in the NAT system a couple weeks ago. That was about how they process waypoint names, and the one thing that comes up with aviation is that you have to maintain backwards compatibility. You
Absolutely.
can't. There's a lot of stuff flying around from the 50s, 60s. A lot of the Cessnas are built in the 50s, and kind of in this heyday of aviation, that was a long time ago. And as programmers, it's easy to think, there's got to be. Why can't you pass around UUIDs and have these all flying around? So there's never ambiguity. You think, well, that it has to be written down by hand. It has to work on old radios. All these different design constraints that are based on technology from literally our great-grandparents' generations.
Absolutely. It's unbelievable, really, how advanced aviation has become, but still underpinned by just this completely, by this stage, it is legacy system. There's no way to describe it.
So what lessons can we learn from that? How do we build on maybe older systems while still, it's so tempting as tech people to want to just rip everything out and start again, right? The great rewrite. But how do we not fall down that path?
I guess keeping in the aviation theme, there's sort of iterative improvements, I think, that have been made, or new features, maybe is the best way to describe them if we're likening them to software in the tech world. So things like, we know that old planes are not going to be able to do things like auto landing. They're going to not be relying on they're going to be relying on particular frequencies, particular tech to indicate what their kind of rate of descent should be, etc. But then when you have these new planes coming out with things like auto landing, then maybe that's okay to then start bringing in new features to an old system, because you know that only certain consumers of that system will be able to. So I think it's okay to add new things, just don't break the old ones. And obviously we've seen that happen in lots of cases.
So you're saying we shouldn't give people pilot's license who only know how to use autopilot and don't actually know how to take off or land manually?
Well, absolutely. You have to, I guess you have to think of it as, if you're a commercial airline pilot and 90% of your flying, let's say, is from Seattle to London. Yeah. So Seattle Airport and London Heathrow, I assume, are both fairly technologically advanced airports. So anything that is possible from a technology perspective on kind of the latest 787s probably at the most recent will be supported at those major hubs. If you have to divert somewhere and land at an airport that is not a major hub, but hopefully still has a runway long enough for those planes.
Well, I guess that Great Circle route, you're going to cover a lot of the beautiful, northern Canada, just to pick that route. But I'd imagine there's plenty of quiet airfields between here and there.
That they have to know how to land on those things without the aid of autopilot, without the aid of maybe even instruments, like to be able to. It's like driving a car, I suppose, isn't it? It's you can go and buy a Tesla and it will do maybe 90% of your driving for you. But if that fails, you still need to know how to drive.
Yeah. Well, I remember at one point we had two cars, and one of them was my old 1999 Subaru that I bought from a mechanic for $300. And the other one, it was a newer car, and it had a little alert that played when you were backing up and you got too close to something. And I was so accustomed to that, I got in my old Subaru and backed right into the wall, right? Because I'm waiting for the beep.
Yeah.
It didn't tell me the beep was the trailer hitch hitting the concrete.
I had something very, very similar. So when was it? It was probably a couple years ago now. Had to have my bumper my car replaced, front bumper, and bumper was replaced. They had to replace some parking sensors as well. There was a storm and a tree branch went through the car. So took it to the garage. They did all of that, but they didn't turn the front parking sensors back on again. So with this like completely pristine bumper, I then drove into work, and first thing I did was naturally ding it on a lamppost because you're expecting these beeps to start going off. And you think getting very close, but just relying on this tech, and it does show how much of a dependent society we are now on technology, whether it's new shiny tech or whether it's tech that is as old as that air traffic control system.
I always debate myself with this, with part of me, like I think about my kids who are learning programming and thinking they will never have to know it to as low of a level as I did, but I can say the same thing with me and my dad. He had to know assembly language and punch cards. I didn't have to know any of that, and I feel like okay, there's a abstraction level below which I don't understand, and for my kids, that's going to be a higher level below which they understand. Or I mean, they could if they wanted to, but they probably just won't. They're not going to bump into the constraints that are going to put them down that path. And you're always thinking, okay, how much of this is okay? But then you start, we are all dependent on highly functional societies, high levels of abstraction, and you go down that road, and before you start, you try to mine your own metal ore and grow your own food, and it's hard to really. I guess you recognize how tall the tech stack that we're standing on is. There's
that cartoon that always makes me laugh a little bit, where it kind of depicts this modern tech stack, and it's piled high with all these like shiny things, and then right at the bottom there's this like one unmaintained npm dependency that if that wasn't there, nothing would work. And tech is so fragile today. You think how you can architect for resiliency, high availability, but somewhere there's always something that will break.
Oh yeah. Well, do you remember the whole left pad? I think that's the npm dependency you're referring to, where there's an npm module that's one line long, which is left padding strings. The author pulls it from npm. Everything downstream breaks, and there's major websites that are out for days because of this, and it highlighted the fragility of this one ecosystem. We're seeing the same thing with supply chains, right? If there's one factory that makes a particular widget that we all need, and all of a sudden you can't buy new cars that have certain features that were promised because you can't get the chips that make the integrated circuits that make the right cruise control or the adaptive lane holding or whatever feature it is. Sometimes you have to go in later for that if that's what you want.
I think that's where sometimes the growing adoption of AWS to the massive scale that it is now is dangerous. It's you look at when there's an outage in a region and the amount of the internet that goes down with it, and it makes me laugh because it's then really easy to identify those customers that have not got any disaster recovery or resilience in place, because you lose a region and either it's not important enough for them, or they just haven't bothered to think about the chances of. I mean, US East 1 is probably the kind of meme almost of outages now.
But then on the flip side of that, so we had something that went down, and we realized, okay, we don't have to do anything. This will just come back up. Yeah. None of us are going to get paged for it. Someone is going to lose a bit of sleep over this, but it's not us because we've bought into the system. So it kind of goes both ways.
So I'm in the middle at the moment of writing a talk and a blog post, both entitled "Anything that can fail will fail." So Murphy's Law, and I'm really interested in this idea of kind of introducing chaos engineering to more people. So the concepts of it's all well and good architecting your application to say, yeah, I've got EC2s in every availability zone, etc., etc., etc. But actually, unless you're testing it, unless you are running experiments to say, okay, I'm going to simulate hardware failure in this particular AZ, then you can't be sure that it's going to work. And the time that you find out that it works shouldn't be the time that a real outage is happening, because it might not.
And the question is it important enough to plan for, or just say, okay, by default, or based on historical patterns, this is how much it goes down. I'm still really easy to be in one AZ of one region rather than doing multi-region, multi-AZ. That might be a perfectly acceptable trade-off.
So I think we would normally go down the route of kind of saying to people, there's a sliding scale almost. So you can start off with your, okay, let's have the minimum really, which is an auto healing EC2 instance. So you only need one EC2 instance running at a time. So let's choose an availability zone at random. Let's deploy it in there with a load balancer and an auto scaling group. So if one availability zone fails, that's fine. Within a few minutes, a second EC2 instance is spun up in one of the healthy ones, hopefully. Then you kind of have this middle ground of, no, we need our application to be up all the time, but we can deal with a couple of minutes of reduced performance. So maybe you have application servers spread across availability zones. So that's one way that I try and kind of pitch it to people, is think, what's your tolerance to downtime? Is it an application that if it's down for 10 minutes, no one's going to notice? Or is it something where if it's down for 10 minutes, someone will notice? If it's a bit slow, it's okay, but not ideal. Or you have the full extreme of this cannot ever experience anything. So you have to almost double up your capacity. So you think, well, if my baseline performance I need requires 2 instances, then I need to have probably 2 instances in every availability zone. So if I lose 2, I've always got 1 left. Or go multi-region, or introduce many other things. But it is this always this balance of risk and cost.
Well, I think that's what we touched on earlier about learning to think probabilistically and learning how to weigh up those things. Because people always say this should never happen. Well, what does never mean? Never. It really means, look at S3 scale, where they say a 1 in a trillion event happens every 45 minutes, whatever it is. So when you think about this should never happen, well, does it really mean how much are you willing to insure against that? And what does that come down to? Right? Think about a power outage, right? It's really easy to have some flashlights and some backup batteries, or if you really want to, a generator. But if you want to make yourself capable of withstanding a power outage of more than a few hours, all of a sudden you're talking a pretty big investment to get there.
But it's the S3 point made me think of something. So S3 doesn't guarantee 100% durability, not absolute 100%. It's very, very close, but it's not 100%. However, everyone just assumes that it's safe. But if you said to a customer, okay, you're putting this data in S3, there's a chance you could lose this data. It's 11 nines, isn't it, for S3? So it's however many, it's a tiny percentage chance that you would lose your data in S3, but it's a chance. Technically, it could happen. And it makes you think, if you said to a customer, you might lose your data, how many of them would then think, well, if I might, I'm going to have backups? Because a lot of people just put data in S3 and think, well, it's safe. AWS are doing the durability part for me. They're kind of backing it up per se across availability zones. But availability zones aren't that far apart. The 30, 40 miles is not a lot when it comes to big natural disasters.
Well, and also backups, you could be the case. I don't know, I have a certain S3 buckets are mirrored to certain local drives. So if I do something dumb on my local drive, it's going to mirror that change. Yeah. And so I also want snapshots that are detached both physically and in process from my backups. And also I've seen cases, well, a long time ago in my quote consulting, this is when I was a teenager, I was helping out this factory, and I knew the owners, and I was just helping out with a little bit of the front desk stuff. And they had these backups that were perfectly archived floppy disks with, date, time, and everything. But the person who was making the backups was always just clicking past a little screen without ever bothering to read it. And so I stopped and I said, let's actually read the screen. Realized they had like months of just blank floppy disks that were perfectly archived.
Yeah.
So like, are the backups tested? Are they reliable? Can you actually restore from them? Is there enough metadata in there so you can be back up and running?
And this is actually something that is part of the AWS well-architected framework. Is you can go through and you can say, I back up all of my data. Backups are regular. Backups are encrypted, etc. And happy days. But if you're not doing game days and simulations to actually test if I need to use this backup, how long is it going to take? How much data am I going to lose? Does it work? Then you're not considered well-architected.
That's a really, really good point. A friend of mine made the point. She said, I love it when I have to cancel a credit card because it's this chance to audit all of the recurring charges that she's racked up over the last since the last credit card. And it's a really good way of putting it, right? Like, you have to test these procedures out early. Otherwise, you're going to accumulate things that aren't backed up, right? These, whether it's a piece of configuration or just some unknown that you don't realize has become part of your stack that you then need to account for and needs to be backed up so that way you can actually restore when it counts. And that's part of this overhead of running any kind of technology, is that you have to plan for how do you replace it.
You almost need to say to a customer, if you cannot deal with the outage of an entire region, then I want you to spin up a new AWS account and I want you to go into a different region and get this started all over again and see how long it takes. Because it won't be what their RTO target is. Yeah,
that's a really interesting point, right? Even if you had a bunch of good CloudFormation templates and you're just changing the account number and changing the keys, it's still it's always harder than it seems, or harder than you'd estimate.
There's lots of different kind of DR strategies. The only reason this is in my head is because I wrote a blog post on it on the plane on the way here, and it's kind of a scale of 4 strategies. The top one being like fully fledged mirror of production environment. It's something that is essentially going to handle production traffic at the flick of a switch. So you maybe you have Route 53 health checks or something just to allow you to switch from London to Dublin, for example. Then you kind of have this second one where it's a level down, so you have infrastructure deployed, but not at the scale you need in production. So technically the application works, but in a disaster you need to scale it up to actually make it handle production traffic. So cheaper to run, slower to get going. Then you move down to kind of third lowest, being, okay, data's there. You kind of real skeleton, like an application isn't going to work. So maybe you've got a load balancer there, maybe you've got an auto scaling group there, but your scaling group is set to have no EC2 instances. So it's it's kind of real bare bones. It's not going to handle any traffic, but again, it's going to cost you even less money, but you couldn't handle any traffic in the event of a disaster until you've done some work. And the last one being, obviously you have to provision everything again, but data is there to allow you to do it. And finding where your risk tolerance and where your kind of RTO and RPO objectives fit in those 4 boxes is really important. And it's really difficult as well, because often, well, customers don't like spending more money than they have to, and I guess rightly so. But when you pitch it to them as, okay, well, if your infrastructure is going to cost you, I don't know, $100,000 a year, if you double that and run it in another region as your kind of fully hot disaster recovery solution, then doubling your infrastructure cost. But if you had an outage and it took you a day to re-provision everything to get back online, and let's say the AWS region was out for a week for some reason, then would it cost you more than £100,000 in a day in lost revenue or fines or whatever? And quite often the answer is yes.
That's a really good way, a good structured way of thinking about it, because it could be yes, it could be no, right? It could be just wait for the region to come back.
Yeah.
Everyone have a day off, and
it's all to do tolerance. It's just how much risk can you afford to absorb. You think of it as an insurance policy. It's like you have insurance for your car. It's you pay it, you hope you never have to use it, but it's there so that if you need it, you've got something to fall back on.
And to make sure that you don't have any circular dependencies in your process, right? If all of your process, say if you have a website, an internal website hosting your processes for how to get back online, and that's hosted on your exact same piece of infrastructure, well, step 1, go find that website.
But it's even things like that the people don't necessarily think about is they say, oh, well, we're gonna put everything in, I don't know, Confluence, for example. And I don't know what Atlassian's tech stack is, but I suspect there's probably some AWS in there somewhere. So let's say that Confluence stores everything on AWS. Pure speculation, no fact behind that, but just for argument's sake. If you don't know that, and you store all of your documentation in there to get back online, you haven't made a conscious decision to store your documentation in the same region. But just by extension, the outage of that, you are then relying on somebody else to get your website back online again. So without kind of going into full like doomsday scenario mode, you almost need like printed documentation.
It's not a bad idea. Or at least printed, I don't know, phone numbers of the 4 people you need to call to get the process started.
Or pay for business or enterprise support and then shout at AWS down the phone.
There you go. Well, looking at the time, I think this has been a fantastic conversation.
It's been great.
I really appreciate it. This has been really fun. And I hope you have a great flight back to the UK. And maybe we'll do a follow-up in a year from now.
Absolutely.
Really fun. I'll put the link to your blog post right there in the show notes. Thanks again, Alex.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right. So that was the interview with Alex Kearns. His website is alexkearns.co.uk. I've put that in the comments earlier. Let me put it up in a banner. It's a very simple URL, alexkearns.co.uk. There's some really fun content. Let me put it on the screen real quick. Oop, not that one. Let's do, sorry about that. Let me present the right window here. Present, share screen. It is this. There is Alex's website, alexkearns.co.uk. This is him with AWS Insiders last year that we were talking about there. He's got a reInvent 2023 session guide, so have a look there. And thank you, Alex, for joining us. We really appreciate that. And for those of you who are celebrating, have a happy Halloween. I remember you are Kenough. All right. And hopefully you have a good, happy, safe Halloween. please tune in. Let me just go over the episodes coming up. We have got a generative AI hackathon with Rahul and Harsh Arya coming up on Friday, November 3rd. November 7th, we have got Carlos Galan, and we're going to be talking about him, about FinOps, building a FinOps practice. He was AWS for a long time and then moved to Just Eat Takeaway. He's coming up on the 7th. November 10th, which is the Friday after this Friday, so next Friday, we've got Justin Thomas talking about generative AI and reInvent, and we have more to come as we get closer to reInvent. Thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate you being here, and we're signing out until Friday. And please, message anything in the comments you'd like to see or any questions about reInvent that's coming up. I would love to take your questions at the next show. All right, thanks everyone. Goodbye.
Some tools just find AWS cost savings and make you do all the work. Visualizing cost opportunities is great, but that's not enough. CloudFix, on the other hand, actually delivers those savings for you. And you don't need to worry because CloudFix fixers are AWS recommended and easy to use. It's the only tool that fixes cost savings opportunities and doesn't just find them. It's the easiest way to save money on AWS. It's all 100% automatic and risk-free. And the best part is that it works non-stop. See for yourself. Click on the button to get a free demonstration of CloudFix and stop overspending on